He felt dragged out, his breath rushing, wheezing in and out of his mask. The air was becoming moist and frigid, and through the scream and boom of weapons fire, the sound of approaching rain marching across the metal of Azure City could be heard. His flesh was terrified, and his limbs shook hard with both exhaustion and more. Above him, the black clouds roiled and flashed, but it was not just lightning which wove in and out from between them, the aerial battle over the ground forces having moved almost directly over the park. His mind was horrified, filling and then overflowing with emotions, sensations, and thoughts. Before him were the barricades of the enemy and the inescapable honor of his duty as a corpsman. Above all of that, the spinning and often burning forms of Imperial and Republic aircraft, which fell in balls of hateful flame, descended in wide variants around the multitude of spires below them, crashing and exploding like man-made meteors. The smell of caustic fuel and singed metal was so thick it almost seemed to impede his forward movement, only helping the fear which chewed at his body and devoured his mind drill ever deeper. And yet, in spite of this, 1313 was in the throes of elation. His spirit soared such that he barely felt the pain in his bruised legs or the weight of his gear as his aching, booted feet pounded down on the broad, pale metal avenue of the alien hive city. Bolts flew past him, coming so close as to sear the processed and oiled leather which composed most of his mask. He didn't even try to dodge anymore. 1313 was part of the 5th rank, first row. He had been forced into the former, but had been granted the latter at his silent request. Though a scant few of the 4th rank had managed to reach the barricades, the true task fell to him and his. He would either die gloriously drawing fire away from others, or he would kill gloriously by vaulting the first barricade and falling upon the foe with zeal. The Krieger had wisely chosen a section of the barricade that was not glowing, but knew that he would not be the only one to select it. He had no intention of getting jammed at the choke point, and to avoid that there was only one thing he knew he could do. Be the first one there, the first one over. Naturally, that meant he had to run faster, and equally naturally, that prevented him from dodging or otherwise impeding himself. He could only speed up, never slow down, not when he was so close, so very close. And, as naturally as everything else mentioned thus far, 1313 knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that all his brothers around him would have come to the exact same conclusion. He was aided in his attempt by the fact that he was the fastest man in his platoon, despite being a fresh recruit from the death world of his decanting. He was impaired by the equally true fact that he had nearly broken his legs falling to rescue the Major earlier that day. But the combination of both was what ensured his success. Had he been faster, as several of his brothers were, he would have been targeted en masse by the focused fire of the gleaming white soldiers who huddled behind their emplacements. But Had he been slower, his hand would not have been the first to land on the lip of the barricade. The clone standing there had fired a volley at another Krieger who had been just in front of 1313 and had not been fast enough to catch the second guardsman after killing the first. The corpsman did not scream or cry out, focusing all of those things into his body and purpose as he vaulted the barrier, one hand holding his lass as he braced the butt of the weapon in the crook of his arm, while the other hand landed and pushed against the wide lip of the barrier in question. He didn't make any noise more overt than a grunt as he planted a hard kick into the clone trooper's chest, knocking the Republic soldier back and creating space for himself to land. The clones beside him swung to face him and fired. The first shot flew wide as the head of the clone who shot it blackened, the soldier screaming as his flesh and brain cooked in a spray of last shots that came from beyond the barricade. The other shot was much more precise, but 1313 managed to duck it by charging forward, bracing his lasgun in both hands and aiming the bayonet towards the enemy as he did. The clone he had kicked was recovering swiftly from his stagger, but his DC-15A blaster rifle was heavy and had a very long barrel. He swung the blaster down to fire it and did, but the end of the barrel cracked against 1313's hard helmet, firing behind the Krieger as he rushed in. The corpsman almost stumbled into the clone as he thrust forward with the bladed end of his weapon, just managing to catch himself before going down. The Republic soldier cried out, white armor splitting and cracking as hardened Mechanicus-forged steel slid into him. They both hit the back of the second, taller barricade and collapsed in a tangle. The remaining clone turned to fire, hesitating as he stepped back and tried to safely shoot 1313 despite his proximity to the pained, groaning form of his pod brother. That hesitation cost him as another Krieger vaulted over the same spot 1313 had just come in through, knocking the barrel of the clone aside and beginning a grapple. 1313 did not pause or hesitate as he pulled the trigger of his weapon once, twice, and then a third time, satisfied when the clone ceased its screaming. The Imperial pulled back and away from the Republic soldier as the jerking movements of an all too familiar human death throw took possession of the replique's burnt body. The Krieger turned just in time to watch his own brother, 1315, finishing with his clone combatant. The two had wrestled to the ground, losing their weapons in the struggle. 1315 had seized the clone's helmet, ripping it away before clasping his gloved hands around the Republic slave's neck. In response, the clone at first clawed at 1315's unflinching masked face before clasping his fists together and raising them. He brought them down again and again on the Krieger's face, cracking the lenses of his mask and damaging the respirator tube, but nothing the clone did could make 1315 release his ever-tightening grip. 1313 busied himself with firing over his brother's shoulder into the ranks of the clones lining the barricades, many of whom were already dealing with Kriegsmen in their midst. When 1315 had finished his grisly work, he looked at 1313 through the empty eye holes of his mask, the lenses completely dislodged. Yellow, bloodshot eyes gleamed in that darkness, and with a nod, 1313 knew to move forward and take point. The double-layered barricades meant that, even now, they were still losing Kriegers, but as more and more of them made it to the first layer of barriers, the difference was becoming clear. Moving among these confines, even when under fire, was their speciality, and the clones stood no chance within close range. Some of the Republic sergeants and other officers appeared to have requisitioned some potent combat knives prior to the battle, but the rank and file had no such armament, and it showed. The Imperials, by contrast, drew entrenching tools, combat knives, and bore their bayoneted rifles as they poured into the close confines behind the barricades, the touch of their forward forces like acid against the pristine white defenders. The roiling clouds above them released blasts of cold wind, and soon rain as well. The approaching and then thickening sheets of freezing water reflected the light of lasfire and blaster bolts as it swept over the embattled positions. Fog rose from the heated bridge, its surface pocked with weapons fire, and from the fighting soldiers of either side, the mouths of their weapons hissing and sizzling, mixing steam and smoke into a gray miasma which stalked the battle like a specter. The repeating blaster cannons began to fire into their own first barricade more and more as the Death Korps of Krieg cut into and through several positions along the first line. 1313 heard the cavalry horns blow again, but knew that he and his had been the last of the charging infantry ranks. In other words, Major Lazarus's plan depended entirely on what they could do, here, now, using only what had managed to survive the butchery on the bridge. 1313 and 1315 were facing down a massing group of clones who had managed to repel the Kriegers gunning for their positions. Having successfully weathered the death charge into their defensive line, and having many, many more forces within the barricades than beyond them, the clones turned their full attention to their flanks. One line of clones lay straight down on the ground, another line kneeled over them, and the last line stood over the second, all of them bearing their long rifles and creating overlapping ranks of blue fire, which they sent into the Kriegers at either side of them. 1313 and his brother hit the ground hard, ducking the shots and aping the clones as they lay on their bellies, barely avoiding the first volley as they returned fire with their own. 2 clones dropped, but many, many more shot back. 1313 could smell the acrid stench of his and his brother's greatcoats catching fire as several shots found the prone Imperials, burning pain blossoming on his back, left arm, shoulder, and head. His flak armor negated most of the initial damage with the help of the thick, chemically treated coat, and the shot on his head glanced clean off his thick helmet, having struck at an angle. But he had completely lost the use of his left arm, the limb having suffered several strikes and becoming entirely unresponsive, a still mass of hidden, cooked flesh and pain. Almost as fast, 1313 felt his stim implant activate, filling him with numbing heat which bore down on the pain which now assailed him. Not that it mattered. Without his left arm to steady his las rifle, he could do little more than pull his weapon's trigger, which he had not stopped doing anyway. But even had his arm remained functional, there was no way he and 1315 could kill all the clones before them. Luckily, they didn't have to, as the second cadre of Death Riders leapt over the barricades again, but this time aiming their lances down, most catching the helmet or torso of a clone as they passed overhead. 1313 watched as one of the vaunted, fatalistic riders soared over the firing ranks of the enemy. The explosive head of his lance caught the head of one of the standing troopers in the center left of the formation, detonating and killing all the standing clones and several of the others while stunning the rest. 1313 was forced to watch helplessly as 1315 finished off the survivors, still able to effectively wield his own lasgun despite the fire he had also taken. Not only that, but other corpsmen soon joined them, taking over the fighting for long enough for 1313 to rise to his knees and assess his damage. From what he could tell, he would live, which was a shame because he could not tell if his left arm was even still attached to his body under the burnt tatters of his coat's sleeve. He did his best to pat out the scattered flames which feebly licked at his chemically drenched uniform and discarded his lasgun before going to 1315. He was in an even worse way, still laying on the ground, his back and shoulders littered with scorch marks and deep burns. 1313 patted down the flames there and saw right away why his brother had not risen. The corpsman had received damage to his spine in 2 locations, both around his waist. Both would mean he was paralyzed from that point down. 1313 considered drawing his combat knife and ending 1315 swiftly, but his brother's words halted him.
"Drop me up and go!"
The Krieger rasped from behind his mask.
"Are you sure? You're paralyzed,"
said 1313.
"I could,"
he continued, but was cut off.
"An easy death is no death. My arms still work, which means I can still kill. Drop me up and let me earn my death,"
said his brother. 1313 nodded and hefted 1315 with his good arm, pulling him out of the way as to not be trampled. More and more of their brothers were coming this way, shooting and charging in standard silence. Those who had been issued grenades tossed them over the high walls of the second barricades, buying themselves time to fight the clones here in the first row as other corpsmen sought to breach the second. He set his brother down against the wall of the second barricades, kicking 1315's legs in to help support his awkward sitting posture. The crippled Krieger clutched at his own gun with one hand as he was moved, but handed 1313 something with his other hand when the younger Krieger moved away to examine his work. Held tightly in the corpsman's gloved hand was a silver-plated las pistol with the words "Krieg sinned" engraved in extravagant lettering on the side of the barrel. At a glance, 1313 could see that it was an overcharged weapon, a hotshot variant of the standard las pistol, the kind of gun a quartermaster would never issue to men of their ranking. 1313 took the gun with his one good hand, flipping it into his grip before looking back at 1315. The Krieger offered no explanation. He merely gestured with a jerk of his head for his brother to get a move on, and, with a nod, he did. With the combat stims running through him, 1313 found the dead weight of his flopping limb to be more annoying and hindering than painful, but he did his best to ignore it either way as he chased his fellow brothers up the line, looking for a way over the second barricades. Soon enough, the line of Imperials reached a hole burned into the wall, clearly created by the draconic blasts of a melt-a-gun. The men funneled in and were met immediately with slaughter. The clones had repositioned, using the time bought by their first defensive line to distance themselves and take cover behind the stacked trunks of the trees which had once adorned the park. They moved fluidly and intelligently, retreating without shame and redeploying without mercy. While the Death Korps of Krieg was more than willing to bear the losses of their assault, they simply did not have the numbers to maintain their high attrition. More than half of the clones defending the bridge were still alive and fighting, and the Kriegers who had survived the bridge crossing were barely a handful in comparison. The Death Riders leapt and bounded around and behind the enemy, but their lances were spent and their cadre was few in number compared to the clones they needed to disrupt. So, try as they might, their pressure alone was not enough to break the Republic's finest. 1313 charged through the choke point, trying to place his ruined arm in front of himself, hoping it would provide some kind of protection as he ran. He could not tell if it worked, as the man behind him took a shot in the eye and dropped down forward, bearing 1313 down along with several others. They struggled and kicked before a rain of blaster bolts pelted into the squirming pile of soldiers, making them still. 1313 was trapped nearest at the bottom of the pile, though the dead had already clogged the area so heavily that he was certainly not touching the ground. He pulled his pistol hand free of the corpses pressing in and around him and began to take shots. As he did, other holes were burned and blown into the second barricades, and more corpsmen rushed through, helping to disperse the fire, though some clones did notice him and began shooting back. However, it was difficult for the clones to know which body in that pile belonged to the arm that was shooting at them, and while several clones scored headshots, it was on the dying men who were not attacking. 1313 paid them back with shots of his own. Finally, one of the Kriegers managed to get close enough to successfully pitch a grenade into their cover, scattering the clones and buying 1313 the time he needed to struggle free of the pile around him. There were so few of his brothers left that they did not even trample him as he extricated himself, though perhaps this was due instead to how clogged his choke point had become, with men piled nearly to growing height behind him. 1313 marveled at his terrible luck. How on Krieg's damned surface had he managed to survive this long? It didn't matter, he told himself, as he could plainly see that the clones were starting to push them back, something which only happened just before defeat became inevitable. After all, Kriegers did not retreat, not ever. He saw the clones that had been driven away returning to their positions, some sending wide shots at him, which he ducked, running towards them instead of seeking cover among the fallen around him. The corpsman opened fire, his bad arm flopping back and forth, his combat stim starting to wear thin as the rain continued to pelt his uniform and mask. He couldn't tell how effective his shooting was through the mist and rain, but he hoped to kill some of them before they honed in on him. Time seemed to slow as he watched the long spines of their Xenos weapons barrels protrude from over the logs and branches of the fallen trees. He watched as one fired, and then another, and another. He tried to duck, but his feet felt uncoordinated, his adrenaline also beginning to fade now, leaving him devoid of much of his strength. Pain was flooding him from where it had before been staunched, but it was not doing it fast enough to prevent him from trying to complete his charge. Shots sailed over and around him, singeing his cheek and good elbow as the other barrels found him and prepared to open fire. And then he watched as the barrels withdrew or fell away. From the leftmost flank of the clones, a roar came, a defiant cry that the Krieger had not expected to hear in this battle. "Cadia stands!" The war cry was accompanied by the flashing of weapons fire as soldiers wearing Cadian green and tan laid into the clones from their exposed flank. The Imperial soldiers had lined up their shots well in advance of the war cry, and though the clones reacted with admirable speed, it was far from enough as grenades were launched, las shots fired, and autoguns unloaded. The Republic's men were cut down in a few scant heartbeats, and when 1313 managed to stumble around the logs, he found himself aiming at corpses and allies and dropped the muzzle of his gun to point down. Without speaking, the Krieger's eyes followed the path from whence the soldiers had come, seeing other small squads flanking and ambushing the Republic's positions, though the clones were already reacting en masse to the new threat. 1313's sight led him to the skeletal ruin of the second bridge, and there his hidden eyes widened as he saw what was left of the Cadian assault, crossing over the exposed beams and struts of the unguarded, if devastated, avenue. Rifles and weapons held up over their heads, or borne on their backs, the Cadians tiptoed in tenuous lines, walking like ants as they balanced and marched over the narrow crossings afforded to them. Some clones began to fire in their direction, but the only ones exposed now were the tail end of the survivors, and those who had made the journey already quickly honed in on the offending clones, providing cover for their kinsmen. 1313 felt elation and pain flood into him in near equal portions, and he staggered, almost dropping his weapon as he caught himself on the wooden barricades the clones had hastily constructed. Bit by bit, the pain in his body was winning out, filling him up and driving out even the chance to feel or think anything else. The Krieger suddenly felt a swelling nausea fill him near to bursting, and dropped the pistol, his one good hand working at the seals of his mask. He managed to yank the whole thing off his face mere seconds before he threw up his morning starch rations and protein, groaning as his legs threatened to collapse beneath him. The cold rain fell on his face, washing away his sweat and the sick that had spilled over his chin and lips. He felt someone tugging at him roughly, jarring him as he was forced down onto the logs, made to sit as many hands grabbed him from several places. He tried to resist, his vision blurry and filling with red, but his one good arm had been restrained, and he had not the strength in his legs to kick very hard. Something sharp jammed into his neck, at the base of his shoulder, and once more the pain receded, though the warmth of his standard combat stims did not return. Instead, a cold, icy sensation spread from the spot, making him shiver, but bringing his dazed mind to sharp, killing focus. He relaxed, recognizing that the many arms which held him were the myriad mechadendrites of a red-robed tech priest who, even now, was fussing and cutting at the greatcoat sleeve around his ruined arm. As the spider-like form of the machine god's chosen tugged and worked on him like a frenzied mechanic, an armored Cadian approached, addressing the tech priest as she continued her work.
"Any advice, Magos? We caught them off guard, but they are adapting pretty quick, and they still outnumber our surviving forces, but..."
The man started to say.
By a factor of 3.26, enemy has displayed tendencies towards unified adaptation and organization. Maximum deployable force is currently projected to succeed in only 12.1% of simulated battlefield outcomes. Variables are not sufficiently influential or beneficial to provide an acceptable margin for victory. Processing solution. Processing.
The tech priest said, her voice clearly synthesized, though thickly accented in the way of the throne world and its red sister. The Cadian shrugged and looked back at his men before looking back at her.
Care to say any of that in God?
He began to say.
Processing.
She replied, cutting him off as she continued her callous fleshcraft on 1313. Steel wires spooled out from several of her mechanical arms as syringes and daubs dripping with bitter chemicals darted towards and away from his trembling skin, finding breaches, burns, and all else in short order. Thanks to the anesthetic she had applied to him, the corpsman could mostly only feel pressure and vague stinging. It was nothing like the pain which had been blaring within him before, and he found it easy to hold still, though he did look away from whatever it was she was doing to him. A small flock of servo skulls spun and hovered around them, at least 12 in total, all seeming to orient around the tech priest herself like paper lamps circling a cyclone.
Solution deduced. Depriving enemy forces of coordination capacity is the most efficient way to upset current statistics,
she said. One of her long mechanical arms stretched and snapped out, snatching a floating servo skull out of the air like a toad's tongue catching a fly. Her limbs began working on it right away, flipping the squirming skull over and exposing the mechanical components which had been crammed into the vacancies within the human bone. She began to frenzy over the squirming skull in much the same way she was over the Krieger, limbs working with inhuman coordination as casings were unscrewed, components moved and replaced, and new additions applied. As she did both this and her medical work, she continued speaking.
The next objective is to take Teniarmus and interface him with one of the energy cells that the enemy are using to power their repeating weapons. My predictive models estimate a 72.8% chance that those energy cells will suffice for our purpose.
The Cadian nodded and waved to his men, signaling that they would be moving out very soon. They closed in as he began to speak.
What will Teniarmus do once we plug him in? He asked.
The tech priest seemed to finish her work on the servo skull then, taking it and placing it into the captain's hands, the skull's eye lenses and small grapple claws still moving and clamping the air, but its hovering capabilities having been apparently disabled from whatever alterations had been done to it. Its name, Teniarmus, was emblazoned onto a golden plate on its forehead.
He will release a multi-frequency broadcast pulse, and will continue to do so for as long as power is maintained and fed into him. This should bring down their comnet, and thereby impair their organizational and adaptational capacities by 88.8%.
She said.
Right, then we'll get moving to it,
the captain confirmed, tucking the skull under his arm and drawing his pistol.
Wait,
she added. With one more harsh tug to his wounded arm, she stood away from 1313, her mechadendrites lifting him back up to a standing position. He looked himself over, amber eyes widening on his exposed face. The tech priest had amputated his left arm, an act he somehow hadn't felt in any distinct way. Where before had hung the burnt ruin of his formerly functional limb, now all that remained was little more than a hand span out from his shoulder. The sleeve of his greatcoat sewn shut over the stump, hiding the dressing and the flesh it swaddled. The burns and other injuries he had taken had also been located, treated, and bandaged, his uniform having been torn open in the affected areas and then restitched closed once her work had been completed.
Take him with you. He is a member of the Death Korps, and has succeeded in fighting his way to the back of the line. If nothing else, he will serve as another body to distract from your own,
she said. The captain snapped his eyes from her to the unmasked face of 1313, instantly stunned by what he saw. His jaw tightened, and he strode towards him, bending down to pick up the gun 1313 had dropped earlier, looking at it and the words written on it, and then at the soldier before him.
How old are you, Krieger?
The man said. Though the statement was grammatically a question, it was spoken as an order, and 1313 snapped a salute with his one good arm as he answered. 15 solar years, sir, he said to the Cadian. The man nodded grimly, looking back down at the gun one more time.
Are you well enough to fight and not slow us down?
He asked. 1313 gave a sharp, decisive nod of his head, holding his salute, blinking the crisp, freezing rain out of his eyes. The man before him nodded once more and flipped the gun in his hand so that the barrel was held between his fingers and the handle aimed towards the Krieger.
Then take this and follow me,
he said. 1313 broke his salute, taking the gun from his temporary superior and saluting once more. The captain said no more, turning to his men with a whistle and waving them forward as he pulled out a pair of small binoculars and began scanning for the nearest emplacement. While he did this, the tech priest used her many arms to take 1313's mask, wrapping it back around his face and securing it tightly while simultaneously taking the half-spent hotshot power pack out of his gun and replacing it with a fresh one. She spoke not at all as she did this, the many red lenses of her eyes making it unclear if the tech priest was even looking at the corpsman as she finished and turned away. Beginning to move towards another wounded soldier, a Cadian who had taken a shot to the gut and was huffing and cursing behind the others. 1313 hesitated for a moment, but spoke.
Thank you.
The Krieger said to her, not yelling through the rain, but voicing the words nonetheless. She slowed ever so briefly, one of her arms performing a reverse salute in his direction, though she did not turn and did not stop. It was more than he had expected, and he added nothing to it as he turned to wait for the captain's orders. He did not have to wait for very long. The captain was just a little taller than he himself was, with dark skin and pale purple eyes. He kept his hair close to the skull, something which was apparent as the man did not wear a helmet. On the back of his head was tattooed the double-headed eagle of the Imperial Aquila, barely visible against his black skin and the fuzz of his equally black hair.
All right, I've got our target. Stay close and keep your heads down. We are going to follow this line of stacked trees until we are right behind that position over there,
he said, indicating towards their target with an outstretched finger.
Once there, we're going to rush them. Stow the grenades. We can't use explosives or we'll risk damaging the energy cells. Same goes for flamers. Stow them,
the captain ordered. 3 of his squad groaned, slinging 2 grenade launchers and 1 flamer, and drawing combat knives and sidearms.
All right, stay low, stay light, and stay on my trail. Let's go,
he said, and took off, crouching as he went. The squad followed after, the mist and the rain as well as the stacked logs helping to conceal them as they moved up on the first group of clones, who were, themselves, hiding behind wooden barriers, watching to make sure no one snuck up behind the emplacement. But whereas their white and yellow armor practically made them glow among the contrast of the darker trees, the tan and green uniforms of the Cadians and the dark coat of the Krieger with them allowed them to remain inconspicuous as they maneuvered. The squad swung out wide, coming in behind the clones and destroying them in short order. Now in position to charge the emplacement from behind, they had a better idea of what they would be charging into. The firing emplacements were half-domed shells with enough open space in front to allow their repeating blaster free range of targeting. The rear was mostly open and vulnerable, but provided just enough cover to hide behind. The clones inside would be able to hold the position, potentially for long enough for others of their kind to take notice. "We got good cover from here," said a corporal. The woman in question was holding a long las rifle, one of the long-shot variety, and was using the scope on the weapon to scout out the entrance. The captain beside her nodded, but said nothing for a moment as he examined the position. While the corporal was on the captain's right, 1313 came up on his left, with all three of them kneeling behind the trees as they peered between the branches, the rest of the squad kneeling or squatting in the thickening mud behind them.
We could take them from here. Probably lose less men,
she went on. Again the captain nodded, but frowned, clearly not a fan of the idea despite its merit.
Maybe. But they may have time to call for help in that case. Or worse, sabotage the cells. If we do this, we need to do this fast, and...
Hey, Krieger, what are you doing? The captain said, but 1313 was already up and moving. It was hard for him to move around without his left arm. It really threw his balance off something terrible, forcing him to lean oddly and walk sideways as he quickly crept up on the position. The firing of the repeater and the falling of the rain were more than enough to block the sound of his approach, and soon he was huddled by the wall, peeking over the edge. They were crammed in there, most of them shooting out through the wide window, moving around the repeater as it swiveled, all of them helping by supporting their men in the first barricade. 1313 wasn't much for planning, but he knew he had to at least a chance lasting long enough for his distraction to do more than draw attention to the entrance the captain and the Cadians would be using after him. Seeing one clone pull away to reload his long rifle, he moved in, sliding and running right up to the soldier. The clone looked up and was stunned by the sudden appearance of an enemy less than 3 steps from him and snapped his rifle up to fire, but had time for only one shot before 1313 was inside the reach of his long barrel. The shot struck the thick plates on 1313's right shoulder, shattering them, but failing to stop the Krieger as 1313 sent a shot through the clone's right leg. The man cried out in his alien language, and the other clones halted and snapped around, quickly becoming aware of the intruder. The corpsman moved with as much speed as he could, looping around behind the clone he had wounded, pulling them both against the wall near the window and jamming his gun up under the clone's helmet. The Republic soldier collapsed against him and he fell as well, his only benefits being that the trooper's armored body covered most of his own and that his lasgun was still firmly pressed against the man's chin. The clones hesitated and then didn't shoot. 1313 blinked. He was sure they would both be blasted to pieces after the clones realized he had dared to take a hostage. One of them yelled at the Krieger, but of course 1313 had not been taught how to speak almost any of their language and had not been equipped with an autotrans. He had learned a few words, however, to aid in his duties on the planet prior to the counter-invasion. He had not used them once since arriving, but was glad he could use them now.
Bathroom.
1313 said in Galactic Basic, his accent thick, nearly incomprehensible. Though he could not see their faces, he could see their postures, which betrayed their confusion. He tried a different word.
Credits,
he said. The confusion continued in all but one of them, who went rigid for a moment and then spun around, yelling something in his Xenos tongue that was probably analogous to, "He's distracting us." The clone snapped around and fired his rifle, catching one of the Cadians in the chest and throwing him back. The Imperial who came in behind the first opened fire with a shotgun, blowing 2 of the clones away, the one who had fired and the one beside him, before the other Imperials stormed in. The clones turned to meet the attack, but the distraction coupled with how terribly unwieldy their larger guns were in close quarters left them nearly helpless as the Cadians tore into the clone troopers with mid and close-range weaponry. 1313 pulled the trigger of his gun, mercilessly killing the clone he had captured and rolling the dead weight off of his body before rising. The captain approached, executing 2 more wounded clones as he did, face flushed, eyes blazing.
You're lucky that little maneuver didn't kill you, crazy death-worshipping plank.
He slapped 1313's helmet and then turned, pointing at his Cadians.
Jackna, patch up Ithric. Gregor, ready flares.
The captain ordered, walking to the large, square power cell which fed the repeater. The Imperial officer licked his lips, nervous about even touching machines of any kind, but he ultimately determined Xenos technology deserved less reverence than something born of the machine god's will, and pulled the cable feeding the blaster free. He then carefully set the skull down on top of the crate-shaped power cell. The little grappler claws protruding from the bottom of the servo skull clanked and wiggled, pulling it up and enabling it to shamble closer to the now vacant output port. 1313 watched as a single mechadendrite slid out of the base of the skull and fumbled about around the port until it succeeded in blindly feeling it out. It inserted itself, and the whole skull went rigid. The thing then spun, holding itself upside down as another protrusion emerged from beneath and behind its grinning teeth. A long rod which unfolded to nearly 2 hand spans high before bending near the end and unfurling a radar-like dish. While that went on, Gregor, a large Cadian man with a grenade launcher slung over his shoulder, withdrew a flare gun and some green flares. With a nod from the captain, he sent the shining beacons flying over their heads, stepping out from under the half-dome to get the shots off. They blazed like green suns in the darkness and rain, calling more Cadians to their position. Nothing more seemed to happen then, at least to the men within the emplacement. But all across the scattered battles still going on, a shift was starting to occur, beginning with a nasty surprise to all clones with active comms, which was to say, all of them. A piercing screech soon filled their earpieces, disrupting fire, causing hesitation, and forcing some clones to toss off their own helmets. The distraction was a boon to Imperials all across the barricades, but more than that was what came after, subtle though it was. Republic forces began to lose their cohesion as communications died abruptly. Individual squads were forced to rely on themselves, when before they had been part of a greater whole. The clones were no strangers to independent thinking, but the sudden switch sent them stumbling, and soon many squads had chosen to tactically retreat and regroup, failing to realize what this would mean for the clones that chose to stay and hold their ground. The result was bloody chaos. Some of the Republic clones tried to take back the emplacement, perhaps having even deduced that the source of the comm jamming was coming from there, but 1313 and the Cadians repelled them each time, and as more minutes passed, more and more forces gathered at their position. Finally, most of the clones seemed to settle on a retreat and regroup strategy, and save for the far sides of the bridge, abandoned their barricades, sabotaging the weapons they left behind as they did. This lull in the fighting afforded the scant survivors of the Imperium time to gather and prepare for the counter-assault the clones would inevitably throw back against them. The majority of the Death Korps and Cadian shock troops quickly gathered around the comm jammer, following the flares. The remaining tech priests roamed and roved around the emplacement site like busy insects, using monomolecular blades and plasma torches to cut away chunks of the barricades, ferrying them from the first line and re-cementing them in new defensive positions meant to repel invaders from the opposite direction. Heavy weapons were recovered from the dead, while the wounded were gathered and placed within cover for medics and tech priests to examine and tend. 1313 found himself sitting on a log within the new ring of rapidly forming defenses, his silvered pistol holstered, a protein bar clutched tightly in his one hand. Around him sat the Cadians. He had sought to rejoin the others of his corps, but the soldiers in green had been insistent, and 1313 had found himself too withdrawn and far too exhausted to deny them. They sat in a rough circle around a plasma burner, which provided them with just enough warmth to negate the utter cold of the still falling rain. Above them, the battle in the sky raged on, moving closer, and then farther, and then closer again, fire and lightning descending from the sky with near equal regularity. A Republic gunship fell, spinning from above, firing wildly before crashing 40 meters away from where they sat. The crash made most of them flinch, but no one moved or reacted outside of that.
So, Krieger, what the hell got into you back there?
Asked one of the Cadians, a woman named Jackna. She wore the red spiral of the Medicae, but seemed little different from the rest in all other respects. Her eyes were a light violet, and her short hair was a burnished orange which stuck out from under her helmet in random, matted tufts. She had her own protein bar, holding the rectangular ration pack with one hand as she pulled the long plastic pin attached to it with the other. Once the pin was pulled free, the packet inflated to the point that it looked like it might burst before a little hole popped open on the end of the bar, ejecting a line of steam which whistled for a moment before petering out. She then peeled the pack open, revealing the gray, puffy substance of the ration, consuming it eagerly. 1313 simply shrugged in response, face still hidden behind his mask.
Oh, come on, you really going to be humble? You charged into a nest of enemy soldiers with so much confidence they didn't even know you didn't belong there before you got a hold of one of them,
said another man, Julian. This man was enormous, far larger than everyone barring Gregor, who was just smaller. His head and face were clean-shaven, revealing a motley of scars and burns, as well as his cybernetic eye. The man was on his third ration bar. 1313 nodded but added nothing else, making the man's face fall flat. How about we get his name before we try prying into how he thinks? Asked another woman in the group, a round-faced Cadian with long black hair. She cradled a long-shot lass, even as she ate, though she had loosened her flak armor for comfort and tossed off her helmet, allowing the rain to fall directly onto her. Her name was Emiliana, ranked corporal. So, what's your name? I'm sure they give you a name in the Corps, she asked, polishing off the rest of her own ration bar. 1313 nodded, but did not say anything else right away. A harsh laugh followed that, coming from Gregor, who sat opposite the Krieger. The man was thicker than he was tall, and it was all muscle. His brown hair was cut short, completely shaved on the sides and flat on the top. He smiled an unpleasant, unamused smile.
Don't bother with him, Emiliana. Kriegers don't like to talk or fraternize with non-Kriegers. They think we're lacking in faith or conviction, because we don't die as often as they do,
he said with a sneer. Emiliana frowned at that, looking first at Gregor and then at 1313. Is that true? Do you really believe that? She asked him. He paused before answering, as if considering the question. This was probably the longest he had ever spent interacting with people who were not from his homeworld, and, honestly, it was also one of the chattiest interactions he had ever been party to. But being chatty didn't make one unfaithful, or speak to their conviction. And, obviously, it only made sense that there would be faithful beyond the boundaries of Krieg. After all, Krieg had sinned, and they had not. But more than anything else, he reflected on what he had seen and experienced in their company.
No,
he said, adding no more. Jackna smiled and raised her eyebrows, and Horsten, one of the men wielding a flamer, chuckled into his hands as he crouched over his bar, eating silently as the conversation went on around him. Well, see that? Emiliana said brightly. We must not be so bad. Gregor rolled his eyes, but did not contradict her, and went back to his food. 1313 looked back down at his bar, and then heard the woman next to him chuckle. Looking over, he almost leaned back and away as Emiliana leaned in towards him, coming close as she reached for the ration bar in his hand. Here, let me, she said, taking the plastic pin and yanking it for him. The packet heated and inflated in his hand, but she did not pull away. Still so very close to him, so close he could almost smell her through the rain and rebreathe her. Balancing her rifle in her lap, she reached her arms around his head and undid the lowest of the buckles which secured his mask. 1313 sat like a statue, feeling an odd, human sensation flush through him. His stomach tightened, his face felt hot, but he did not move an inch, trained to hold fast in the face of anything resembling fear. She pulled up on his mask, and he almost dropped his heating protein bar to stop her, but she seemed to notice and shushed him, only pushing the mask up far enough for his mouth to be exposed. There, she said, drawing away, taking her rifle back into her hands. He gave her a hesitant nod.
almost flinching when the packet in his hands popped and began venting steam, his head snapping round to eye it. Jackna grinned and Julian laughed, while Gregor spat to the side like he had just tasted something bad.
Careful, Corporal,
said Julian.
Kriegers ain't trained to handle that kind of battle.
Upon hearing that, 1313 felt a true blush color his face for the first time in years, and he brought the bar up to his mouth, tearing the packaging away with his teeth and spitting it before starting to eat. Emiliana smiled wickedly at her comrade and shrugged. I have no idea whatsoever what you could possibly mean. Look sharp, said the squad's sergeant. He had been away at a meeting with other members of the command staff, and now came back into the circle unexpectedly, geared and standing as if ready for battle. No one needed to hear or see any more to get ready, tightening armor, checking weapons, and standing all at once.
They coming back already?
Asked Gregor. Yeah, and with a hell of a lot of friends, said the sergeant, a squat, thickly built man named Vetnex, though called Vet for short. Vet tossed Gregor a pair of binoculars, and the big man wasted no time in coming to stand on the logs to look over the new barricades and trenches which had been built. The sight made him spit and curse.
Emperor's fecking teeth,
he said, coming down and handing Emiliana the binoculars. 1313 went to stand beside her, and though she still used the binoculars, she barely needed them at all. Nearly 2/4 of the defending force had survived the retreat, and what was coming back was well over 3 times that number. So massive a force that they were plainly visible as an indistinct horde of white, even through the distant rain and flashing of lightning. What's the plan, Sergeant? Asked Emiliana, eyes transfixed as she watched.
There is no way for us to kill that many replicae, even dug in. They outnumber us 10 to 1,
said Jackna.
We're pulling back across the bridge, and there's no point in just dying here,
said Gregor.
Aw, come on! We can hold them until more guys arrive,
said Julian, punching Gregor's shoulder. All of you, quiet down, snapped the sergeant. We have been conferring with the Death Korps, and they have let us in on the larger strategy. Major Lazarus is leading the rest of his forces through the connecting passageways that the clones have been using to retreat. He plans to come up behind their lines, kill their crews, and destroy their artillery. But for that to work,
he needs an Emperor damn distraction,
concluded Gregor. The sergeant nodded. It ain't a glamorous job, but it's our job. Once we see his signal, we can begin retreating back across the bridge. But until that happens, we have to not only hold, but fight hard enough that all they can see is us. You lot got that? The Cadians snapped to salute at the words.
Sir, yes, sir,
they said together. All right, then get ready. 5 minutes. Take care of what you can, then meet right here to find out where you are going. Eat if you can, shit if you can't, but don't be late. Go get on with it, said Vet before going back the way he had come. 1313 watched on, and when the speaking was done, turned back to see the sluggish tide of white moving towards them. He wondered briefly if they were taking their time because they were confident in victory, or because their comms being down truly slowed them by that much. He didn't break his gaze as Emiliana began to speak from beside him. How many of them do you think are out there? She asked. He shrugged his shoulders, but then, after a moment, added something.
1,313,
he said. Huh? She asked, turning to look at him.
My name,
he clarified,
is 1,313.
She nodded slowly, but smiled after a moment. All right, 13. Until this battle is done, you are part of my squad. Do you have a problem with that? She asked. He didn't respond right away, looking at the other men of the Death Korps, most of whom were digging or expanding the trenches, something he could not exactly aid in with his one arm. His brothers would tolerate him, but he was a cripple, and they would treat him as such. Perhaps it was an echo of his human origin, preserved even through the Vitae womb which birthed him. Perhaps it was merely his tired, drugged mind choosing the path of least resistance. Perhaps it was just the weakness of a 15-year-old boy. But 13 did not deny her. He merely shrugged. She slapped his right shoulder, beaming as he flinched from the blow. The blaster burned there, sending a jolt of agony through him.
Alright, then load up and eat what you can while you can. I'll let the others know you are sticking around for the fight.
He looked at her and nodded, watching as she left to tell the others about his inclusion. 13 didn't know how he felt about the decision he had just made, but as his eyes moved back to the mass of white-clad soldiers coming over the barren hills, he began to doubt that it would matter. Dying among the Corps, or dying among the Cadians, it made little difference. Death would be inevitable. Death was his destiny. Unless, of course, the God Emperor chose otherwise.
Once proud stood the mighty fortress, held the eye at bay. For eons they watched the darkness evermore. They delayed, while many lived in comfort. They stood against them with their lives. 'Tis duty, their curse, 'tis their pact, their lives. Acadian blood paid the price, none more valued in the fray. Dirt and mud now crimson cast for mankind and in his name. Acadian blood, no warrior's pride, blessed and cursed like night and day. Through the darkness, vengeance incarnate shall now lead the way. Once brought stood the mighty fortress, held the eye at bay. For eons they watched the darkness evermore. They delayed, but then rose to the spoiler, with legions in command. With bloodthirst, stormed the fortress and made it crack. Now fallen the mighty fortress, the horrors it held rampant. No force to push the darkness back. Now was the end of an era. But no more who hearkened their song. Their home fell before their fervor. Their spirits now shine bright and fueled by vengeance, wrath, and anger. Acadian blood paid the price. None more valued in the fray. Dirt and mud now crimson cast for mankind and in his name. Acadian blood, a warrior's pride, blessed and cursed like night and day. Through the darkness, vengeance incarnate shall now.
Hey there, everybody. This is a fan with too much time, and I really hope you guys liked that last one because I did work on it quite a bit. You know, sometimes you just get a little bit of writer's block, and you have to go over a concept a few times before you can really get it out, which is why this one took longer than it normally does. But that aside, before I forget, because as you know, these are kind of unscripted, so let me just put this here in the front. Go ahead and vote in the comments section what you want 1313's fate to be. 1313 might be one of those lucky Kriegers that lives a very long time. Or he might be one of those lucky Kriegers that dies very quickly. It's all lucky according to who you ask. So go ahead and vote and help me decide, or at least, you know, we can make this a bit collaborative. So get in here and help me decide if he should live or die. And go ahead and throw in your suggestions too as to how you think they should happen. No promises, no commitments either way with any of it, but I'm definitely reading every single comment you guys put. And like I told you before, any characters that I make up have substantially less plot armor than any characters that exist in the lore already, so you already know that spiel and how that works. Aside from that, this will be the second to last installment in this whole Lazarus Rising, I guess you could call it a little mini-series aside from the actual series, or aside, or special. So yes, the Lazarus special is almost done. The next episode, which currently is named Vini Vidi Vici, is going to release next week, hopefully. And that will go ahead and conclude that. And so just one more installment to go. And in that one, we will see the fate of Lazarus, the fate of 65, the fate of course, 1313 and his squad of Cadians. And we will also see the general fate of the Imperial forces here, how successful or unsuccessful they are. And the fate of the clones, and how successful or unsuccessful they are. So, with that being said, I do want to make one more thing known. After next week's episode special, I will be taking another hiatus. And, well, I want to say that it will be about a month-long hiatus. I don't really know how long it'll be. It'll be as long as it needs to be for me to be able to competently finish up the very rest of Season 1. So that's right. I'm going to take my hiatus, but when I come back, I will have all of Season 1, hopefully mostly complete or complete and ready to go. And it'll just be a nice, smooth train straight from there to the end of the season. And we'll go ahead and get that wrapped up. And honestly, I feel like I might toss in a bit more than just Season 1. Maybe a few other works, a few other side projects. But, you know, life is life. Things need to get in order. I can't spend all my time making these. And trust me, I really wish that I could. Because this is... If I could just do this for a living, it would be great. Because I love making stories. And I love writing for these sci-fi universes. And I love writing within them. It basically is what I would do if I got to choose, you know, what I get to do. But that aside, just know that there will be a hiatus, and that when I come back, you will get all the rest of Season 1. Yes, that includes the turnout with the squad in the Chimera, the turnout with Shakti and the sister battle. The result of Quinlan Voss and his army of Jedi attacking the bunker, the result of Ayla Secura attacking the temple with her army of clones, the result of Anakin and his exploits on the ship, Ahsoka and her battle with the Electro Priest, as well as, yes, the conclusion of the Librarian battle. Well, of course, the meat of it, and then the conclusion. That's going to be the wonderful thing, is that the reason the hiatus is a bit long is because it's going to be a lot of episodes that I'm going to be producing here. And honestly, at this point, I've stopped trying to give myself an episode count because I am a big proponent of killing your darlings, but I'm also a big proponent of doing things right. And sometimes it's not worth it to rush or to cut things out. A story should take its time, but I'm not saying that it should be extremely, extremely long, but it should take its time. The time it takes to tell that story correctly, that's the time it should take. And trying to pin down if it's going to be a 10 episode or 15 episode or 20 episode season is just... it's not worth the effort or the commitment, because it's not a very powerful commitment. After all, like I've told you guys from the very beginning of when I started having these talks, my main priority when I write these is the narrative, is the story, is telling a good story. And that doesn't just go to the balancing, that also goes to everything, including the scheduling. And that's how I plan to prioritize if I can. So all that aside, I also got a few comments from you guys asking for a bit of a Q&A. And while I'm not prepared to do a whole Q&A right this moment, I will do 3 questions. 3 of the questions I see popping up probably most often, though I'm not counting or anything, just me noticing. Yeah, I'll just go through those real quick just off the top of my head. I've noticed that some of you are concerned with more Warhammer factions appearing in Star Wars. And I hear you. because the idea is supposed to be that it's Warhammer versus Star Wars, not Warhammer factions versus each other using Star Wars as the battleground, which is what it will quickly turn into if I begin to involve all of the major factions in their major capacities. I mean, you can already see that I only brought in Battlefleet Zektek from a sector that I made up, because it's not a very powerful fleet compared to like Battlefleet Gothic or Battlefleet Solar or Battlefleet, Pacificus. It's a pretty powerful fleet. It is a legitimate battle fleet, but it's an aging battle fleet. It's weighed down by a ton of civilians. The forces that have been brought in, it's not the whole Imperium. I'm about to go on a ramble. What I'm trying to say is that Battlefleet Zektek and the subsector it has evacuated into the Star Wars universe is far from even an entire sector, much less the whole of the 40k universe coming here. I've heard some of you say that you want Primarchs to come in. I don't think I'm going to be involving the Primarchs in this crossover, at least not for a very long time, because I need to be fair, and I'm also trying to tell a good story. If I bring the Primarchs into this universe, they will unmake Star Wars in moments. They will also unmake Warhammer in moments. And you might wonder, wait, what do you mean by that? What I mean by that is at the very moment that the Lion, or Robute Gilliman, or Dorn, or any of the Loyalist Primarchs with see, the thing is that none of them are actually stupid. Like, even Lehman Russ, who is much more given over to battle and to being a barbarian, basically, he's not actually dumb or anything. He's really super intelligent. They all are, just to varying degrees of super intelligence, but they all have a degree of it. And the Primarchs tend to be, the Loyalist Primarchs nowadays, after all of the Horus Heresy, they tend to be extremely self-sacrificial. They want what's best for the Imperium. And they're extremely intelligent and very observant and have incredibly powerful senses. It will take them seconds to figure out what the Star Wars universe is and how they should use it. And with their authority, they would be able to do that. Let's say that Orion gets it into his head that the Star Wars universe is benign, that there's no reason to kill all the Twi'leks, there's no reason to murder all the Todarians, there's no reason to purge all the Jedi, and that that they could even join up with the Republic and it'd be pretty easy. Even joining up with the Empire would be pretty easy because they're so strong they can hold their borders and it's just not smart to attack. Let's say he comes to this conclusion for whatever reason. He's powerfully in this mindset. Orion can't make it happen. I mean, even if he gets his coalition together, he can't make it happen. It's just not how most of the leaders within that faction would allow things to happen. It would be madness. They'd accuse him of heresy, of having a mind corruption. They might even believe 100% that he believes 100% that what he's saying is true, and that still will not be safe. Anyone who knows Warhammer will know that. That doesn't apply to the Primarchs. That's the problem. It applies a little bit to the Primarchs, but not here. Not in this universe. Not when things have been cut off. I mean, Robute Gilliman is made to keep the Ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition around in its current status because of the power of those organizations and what dismantling them or even attempting or even suggesting that kind of thing would mean. But not in the Star Wars universe. In the Star Wars universe, there aren't threats that are so bad that he can't just decide to declare war on the Ecclesiarchy and on the culture of ignorance within the Imperium and defeat it. Any one of them. Any of them. Frankly, it would be extremely easy for them to find a niche in the Star Wars universe where people will just leave them alone. Like, really, just leave them alone. Palpatine wants no part of that, at least not until he's ready to have a part of that. And frankly, by the time Palpatine or anybody gets an armada or a super weapon together that could threaten the Warhammer people, if there are Primarchs in that universe, they will have foreseen that. It will be very easy for them, seeing how the technological development in Star Wars works, to foresee that. And it only takes one squad of Space Marines going to a command center in the Death Star to disable it, And It doesn't even take that much, because honestly, they'd probably, like, if a Death Star ever got built, it'd be entirely just so that the Primarch in charge can steal it. I'm rambling, I'm sorry. The point is just this. The Primarchs are maybe the most overpowered thing in this entire universe, and here's part of the reason why. And this will be the last thing I say on the Primarchs, and before I expound upon how I plan to do this a bit more. The Primarchs, you know, so powerful, so smart, all this crazy stuff. You have to understand this. Humanity has, like I've explained before, and as I think the vast majority of Warhammer fans who are unbiasedly reading the lore will agree, has an enormous power level range. We have dudes that are fighting with almost World War II technology in trenches against aliens that are actually using advanced alien technology. And we win. And we don't always just win by burying them in bodies. We actually sometimes just win tactically, as has been demonstrated by some of our most beloved commissars and beloved Imperial commanders. How is that done? Well, it's just because mankind has gotten so good at waging war that they can take an AK-47 and straight up sodomize the aliens from Independence Day with just that kind of technology. They make up all of their deficits with all this incredible grit and insanity, frankly, and like pure faith and all these other things that move in to make up the difference. Because while the Imperium does have access to some really advanced technology, it does not give access to this advanced technology very easily. One of my favorite YouTubers, Luton, you should definitely check out his channel. He makes several videos that really emphasize this, and the two that are really the best are probably the worst jobs in the Imperium video and his video on Death Strike missiles. I think that's what they're called, Death Strike missiles, which are effectively just chimeras that give up a top turret to carry around cruise missiles. It is a cruise missile, you know, even with an advanced warhead, those things are not very technologically advanced, but they're very reliable the way the Imperium uses them. The problem is that they're just so hard to freaking deploy, and they're just freaking cruise missiles with some really nasty warheads. So my point just is that there's this huge variance, and they make up for it in most cases. You put Primarchs in that, and you have to understand the Primarchs are part of what make that work. Like a Primarch can take a tribe of stick-wielding humans and give him 3 hours with them, and he can probably have them competently fighting against like Eldar who aren't being led by some heroic special Eldar. That's how insane we're talking about, like the making up of things is. So that's why we can't have Primarchs here. They're just, in every way, they're too much, and they would change the Imperium. That's the other thing, is they wouldn't just dominate the Star Wars universe, they would just straight up adapt into it, because they don't want to be in their own universe. They're trying to fix it. That's what all the Primarchs are trying to do. And I don't think it would be different in a huge way with Jagatai and with Leman Russ. They would both still aim that way, even if they do it in a bit of a more war-y way. They would quickly settle into, wow, nice universe you got here. And it looks like we can all share it too, because frankly, our technology takes us to planets that your technology can't take you to, because you're impeded by gravity wells and we're not. So that's the last thing I say on the Primarchs. But what about the other factions? Well, there's a bit more wiggle room there, but yes, I will have to introduce them at best one by one, and most likely I will have to exclude some or introduce them in very limited capacity. However, the Star Wars universe is nearly more equipped to kill the Warhammer universe threats than the Imperium is. Because the Imperium is just really good at waging war and just destruction and fighting. But a lot of these threats aren't threats that you can beat that way. You can't beat chaos that way. You can't. We know you can't. You can fight it off and survive it that way, but you can't defeat it that way. You can't defeat the Tyranids that way. You can stave them off and even destroy some of their hive tendrils, but we've seen what the projected size of that freaking surrounding fleet is. You're not gonna kill that many Tyranids. It's just not. It's not gonna be possible. You can kill your way through a Gene Stealer cult, but that's not the best way of doing things, in part because they're hidden, and it's hard to find them and attack them. That's like the biggest thing that protects them until they're ready to rise up and destroy the planet. There's a bunch of others that are like that. But you know what could beat them? Science could beat them. Science could beat them. And that's what Star Wars has in ridiculous plenitudes. Now, Star Wars has an extremely decentralized scientific system, and the scientific system takes a hit when the Empire takes over, where the innovations are basically very, very one-dimensional and being controlled by a very, very narrow view, that of Moff Tarkin mostly, and the people underneath him and the projects he gives funding to. But before that, you can see how the Republic makes multiple super weapons. And by super weapons, I don't mean like planet destroyers. I mean just special weapons. That's what I should say. Special weapons. They make a multitude of special weapons that are one-off scientific experiments, basically. And the Confederacy does this like it's going out of style. And of course, this is in part because of the episodic nature of shows like the Clone Wars. Both of the Clone Wars, in fact. But it does result in canon that shows us that the Confederacy pumps out scientific developments left and right, just constantly. We've got ancient things like the Harvester. We've got new things like the Blue Shadow Virus and those warheads that weaken metal. And what else? There's so many of them, like the Defoliator. The Confederacy is constantly pumping out these one-shot special weapons. Not even all of them are named. Like in the 2003 Gendry Tarkovsky show, we see Kit Fisto attacking some Quarians on what I think is Mon Cala, and the Quarians deploy an enormous walking underwater sonic cannon that uses the medium of water to create balls of sonic energy that can blow holes out of like Star Destroyers or some shit. Like, it's really, really powerful stuff. We don't ever see those weapons redeployed, and that thing is never named. That is ostensibly a one-off war machine that was developed as a special weapon by the Confederacy. Now, is it kind of dumb that the Confederacy never mass produces any of these things? Yeah. And honestly, they do try sometimes. Whenever they're stated to be trying to do that, the Jedi always destroy the information and the factory and usually capture or kill the scientist in charge. So I guess that explains that, and the Confederacy just eventually is like, just make a bunch of them. If they work and you get them back to base, that'll be a miracle. Again, this is probably because Palpatine was not trying to allow the Confederacy to win, just to be so dangerous that it put the Republic in position to become the Empire. So there are certain Star Wars factions that, not Star Wars factions. There are certain Warhammer factions that will be much more susceptible to the Star Wars universe than you might think, especially if they're being fended off in certain places by forces in the Warhammer 40k universe. And I won't give any more spoilers on that. Just know that I am very conscientious about that balance. I'm always thinking about it, and that Star Wars has teeth, just really weird teeth. But you will see these weird teeth bared in many ways. I have so many plans, and I have a lot. I really hope you guys enjoy the things that I both bring up from the lore, both legends and canon, but also the things that I end up inserting myself, since, of course, the galaxy is going to take a pretty heavy shift. And I hope you don't begrudge me these things, though, of course, I will keep them tasteful and progressive, not progressive, what do you call it? Cumulatively put them in, like, bit by bit, as opposed to dropping in a whole bunch of crazy custom things all at once. I will do it respectfully, is what I mean to say. But moving on from that, Oh, yes, here's a question. When Necrons, I see that a bunch. I'm not sure if it's just one guy or if it's a few of you guys, but I do see it a lot. When Necrons, we want Necrons. Okay, listen. I do have a plan to potentially involve Necrons, but they are one of those things that the Star Wars universe has no way of defending against, and frankly, it is absurd that anyone in the Warhammer universe can defend against them either. They're millions of years old, they've been technologically progressing almost the entire time in little pockets, and they never lost their technology, and they are currently progressing again in full conscious progression mode. They have technologies that let them blow up whole stars without firing a weapon, without giving away that they've done it, without anything. Like, they just go to a big hologram projector that is the whole galaxy, and they put their hand into it and snuff out physically the hologram star of some star, and then at some point in time in the future that star goes supernova, if not immediately. It's kind of ambiguous, but like, it goes supernova, and it just seems like a natural event, and the Necrons are in possession of this technology. That's absurd, man. That's so absurd. So I can't, like, just even if they didn't have things like that, the Silent King, who but a Primarch can match wits with him? I love Thrawn, and I plan to use Thrawn in the future. I'm sure that's not a surprise to anybody who's listening to this. Thrawn cannot match wits with the Silent King. The Silent King is millions, like hundreds of millions, potentially billions of years old. It's really ambiguous how long ago the war in heaven was, and it's really ambiguous how long it lasted. He could be so, like, he is at the minimum hundreds of millions of years old. That's, oh my god, so much combat experience, and he never went to sleep, so it's not like a technical a few hundred million years. No, it's a dead ass, like, long ass time, and he's an AI. He's super intelligent. There's so many things that I can't do, and the Silent King is one of them. He would dominate Orion. He would dominate, and of course you might say, okay, well then just do what you're doing here and just have it be a Necron Lord instead of the Necron Lord. That's the problem, man, is that the Silent King isn't the only Necron Lord. In fact, the Silent King, a lot of people were upset with his character model I saw, because he looks like just some really badass Necron Lord, but that's exactly what he is. Like, the Primarchs are these genetically created superhumans. The Silent King is just a badass Necron, but he's not like, his badassness comes from how badass he is, from what I understand. He has access to the best Necron technology, so there's that, and he augments himself with it, sure, but he's like Belisarius Cawl, you know? He's a normal-ass dude who has upgraded himself, but he is not, like, a special Necron who was created by the Necron dynasties to be the ultimate Necron. Like, that's not what he is. And the reason I point that out is because there are other Necron Lords that can say all the same things I just said about Suzerac. In fact, it might be all of them. I might be able to say that about all of them. Like, all the Necron Lords are about as old as Suzerac is. All the Necron Lords are intelligent, super powerful, super smart AI. All of them still have fully functioning science departments. All of them are... You see what I'm saying? Like, honestly, the Necrons... they're the only reason... Like, I get the impression when I read about them in the lore, for the most part, that they only suffer really tertiary losses to the rest of the galaxy. Their regeneration, their undeath, and their general uncaring for losses and stuff like that make it so that while the younger races kind of feel like they're getting a leg up on the Necrons, ooh, we blew up a tomb world, ooh, we did this, and it really doesn't matter to them. They don't care for the most part. And for the most part, we can't do very much against them. Now, there are exceptions to this that are very powerful exceptions, like the destruction of the world engine, but Oh god, but honestly, sometimes I even feel like that we overblow the significance of that. I mean, it's not the only world engine, and how many more do they have? Do we know? I don't know if we know that or not. I just know that the Necrons really kind of just like we're grass that is sometimes sharp and uncomfortable, but they basically just walk through it. And if they don't, it makes no sense why they don't, because even the Eldari who are about as old as the Necrons, as a society. See, the crazy part is that there's no Eldar who are as old as the Necron that are still around. But that aside, their culture is that old. But their culture has collapsed, regressed. The Necron culture has not. The Necron technology has not. The Eldari have. The Craftworld Eldar have technologies from the Old Empire they won't even touch for fear of how it will corrupt them or tempt them or pull them away from the paths of the Eldar. And the Dark Eldar have all this technology, and half of it, or much more than half of it, they can't even freaking use right because they don't have access to their psychic powers anymore. Even with the rise of the Ynnari, they have to make up for a lot of lost time that they're not going to make up for. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen, man. The Necron never got less deadly. And now they're getting more deadly. This is just fucking crazy. So no, the Necrons, I do have a plan that might involve them, but know that it won't be the Necrons as you know them in Warhammer 40k. Honestly, I don't even feel like going into this because it's almost like making a commitment for something that has an 80% chance of not happening. Because, again, I don't even want to overpack the universe with too many foes, and of the foes I would exclude, Necrons are pretty high on the list because they're too dominant. They're too powerful. So Necron players and Necron fans, take this as a compliment. You're too strong for this contest. Maybe if it were just the Necrons invading the Star Wars universe and nobody else, I could play around with that. Even that feels absurd. See, that's the sad part, is I'm thinking about it and like, but the Necrons aren't dumb. The Necrons don't do misunderstandings. The Necrons don't care if you hyperspace ram their ship. The Necrons won't be screaming and loud. They'll be intelligent and cold and cunning, even if their decision is to literally exterminate the entire universe. And frankly, you're going to need armies of Starkiller bases firing from across the other side of the galaxy to kill them all, and not even to kill them, but to blunt that kind of invasion if it gets rolling. So that's my piece on that. All my ramblings and whatnot when it comes to when Necrons. So the final answer: when Necrons? Probably never. But if they ever do show up, they will be heavily nerfed. They won't be Necrons from the standard Warhammer 40k universe, because those kinds of Necrons would dominate too strongly. The one exception would be like if Star Wars, if like the Star Wars universe copaesthetically combined with all of the forces of the Star Wars universe, and then yes, they could fight the Necrons. Because if the Warhammer people could get on with scientific development and then not try to force everybody in the Star Wars universe who's already a scientist to become a tech priest, they could make some pretty hardcore and awesome advancements that would put them into competition with the Necrons. I'm willing to say that, but guys, that's not an interesting story. Am I right about the Imperium getting along with the Republic and then with the Empire, just so that they can fight the Necrons in Season 3? I'm not doing that. If things spin out to where they can be done that way, that can happen copaesthetically and without it seeming like it breaks the narrative, then it will be done. Everything for the narrative. But as it stands, those are my thoughts. Moving on. Social media presence. I see a lot of you guys asking about my social media presence, and this is what I will say about that. I generally don't social media. YouTube is the most social media that I generally consume, and I'm not just saying that because I have a channel. I consume a lot of YouTube videos. I love YouTube. YouTube is great. I don't like YouTube's comment section so much, but I definitely love YouTube as a social media site, and I like the idea of these sharing videos and all this. It's probably one of the best things, honestly. YouTube is one of the best social media sites. It is very constructive compared to how a lot of these are. I have a personal Twitter.
that I use to look at other people's Twitters. I'm not gonna give that away right now, but I don't even use it that much either. So I'm not very active. I'm not active on Twitter. I can't even say that I'm not very active. I'm not active on Twitter. I have it. I don't use it. Facebook, no, it's terrible. And if you're on Facebook, I tentatively encourage you to consider leaving it. It has done a lot of damage, and it's more and more, like the more and more we look into it, the more and more it appears that the social component of our human minds is very badly abused by Facebook, and is getting more and more abused. There is a documentary called The Social Network, but honestly, I haven't even watched it. It's just been recommended to me a lot. These opinions that I have are based on my observations, and again, not that I like being very forthcoming about my normal like life outside of YouTube, but I went to college for digital marketing, and studied digital marketing rather in college, and let's just say that that's where my expertise on why Facebook is a thing that is bad for you comes from. So I don't do Facebook. I have an amino, but I don't really I don't really use it that much either. I also have a Reddit, as a lot of you have discovered. And I do kind of use Reddit a bit more, because Reddit is a great way of looking and finding at new content, and sometimes when you're looking at content you can't help but post comments. But Reddit is, it's kind of, Reddit has been a very mean place to me. There's actually been 2 times in my life where I have been very close to just dropping the Warhammer community entirely, just because of experiences on Reddit. And by the way, this is not a diss to the Warhammer community, because, you know, it's kind of like how you can get a million compliments and the one negative comment will really hurt you in a way that it really disproportionate to like how much positivity you get. And I'll say this, I heard this from a lot of creators before I ever created anything, and I kind of absorbed the knowledge intellectually, like, okay, I get it, that people feel bad when you diss them. But I had no idea how powerful that was. Like, even in this series, and by the way, don't go bullying people in my comment section, and know that I will go ahead and moderate that. If people start cursing or being disrespectful to each other, I will censor that. I'm not big into censorship, but I am also really big into like the purpose of things and having a culture of respect. And we are here to have fun and enjoy our leisure. That is what this channel is for, and I don't intend to break that purpose often. If I ever break that purpose, it is for things that are extremely personally important, to the point that I need to use my platform to make a statement. And I don't intend to do that unless I'm forced to do that. I really would rather that never have to happen, ever. This is for the love of the work. It's for the love of these universes. It's for the love of the things that bring us together. And I'd like to get as few things between that as possible. And in my comment section, I will have more or less zero tolerance for people being disrespectful. If you want to disagree with each other or with me, that's totally fine. And I will even engage you occasionally. But I will not tolerate cursing. I will not tolerate trolling. I will not tolerate flaming. Please don't make me remove your comment. I've already had to do it to a few people. Be freaking nice. I'm not a GW executive or a person who's in any way authoritative on this lore. If you see something you don't like, please try not to get upset about it, and please try not to call me or anybody who is in my comment section nasty things. And I encourage you to do this. Make something and put it online, just so that you can experience the weird chemical effect of seeing what harsh feedback does. Because it's like a thing that you can't control. You see this harsh feedback, and it's like
like being struck. It hurts to read it. It hurts me. Like it hurts me. It hurts other people. This is why words really do hurt. Like, they don't kill, but words are the way that you can punch somebody without risking killing them, and you can make them feel pain, real pain, over and over again, just by saying things, just by typing things. I don't tolerate that here. We're not trying to be driven apart here. So let's try to keep that nice and courteous in the comments sections. I'm sorry, just got totally off of a ramble right there. Trying to talk about my social media presences. For the most part, I think that social media is kind of damaging. And the reason it's damaging isn't actually, like, Facebook is one thing, because Facebook, we have Mark Zuckerberg, who is not running that company very well, in my opinion, and I will leave that at that. With other social media, what we're finding is that it's not really the social media itself necessarily that is so unhealthy, it's the way people use it. And I don't mean that, like, oh, you're on Twitter all day, or you're on Reddit all day scrolling, and then, like, you're not wasting your time. No, that's not what I mean. I mean that it's very unfortunate, but people in the online space have taken the anonymity of the online space and have used it as an excuse to become heinously uncivil, and we have forgotten the purpose behind civility, or why it's important to have it, why it is absolutely crucial that we have goodwill when we speak to each other and not build up resentment between each other, especially faceless resentment that can then be expressed into just the faceless public. Because the way people are online is not the way human beings act when they are face to face. And you can completely forget that being in these social media places. In fact, you will forget that because you can't help it. Even if you make an effort to remember, physiologically your body can't tell the difference, and it will do this unless you even it out with other interactions. So in my book, it isn't worth it. Maybe use social media only to keep up with actual friends of yours, but it does not lend itself to that, honestly. And so I don't have a lot of it, and I'm not very active on it. So for people asking, where can you find me on social media? You can find me on Reddit. I'm under my abbreviation. And you can find me here on YouTube. And occasionally, very rarely, you can find me on Amino as well. And I'll say this. The only reason that you can find me on Amino at all, and it's not often, at all, is because of how fantastic the Amino community has been to me. They are so nice, so respectful, so courteous. It is a world of difference from Reddit, where Reddit I have had some of the most vile things said to me by moderators. And I try to be very respectful, and I'm willing to say that because I know that any moderator that goes into my comments and looks at my previous things will see that I try. You know, I make mistakes, but I am always trying to put on a good face and a courteous forward. I can't always, no one's a perfect person, but I definitely try, and I find more often than not that trying on Reddit gets you nowhere. People are very mean, they're very nasty, and oftentimes they have power. Reddit is like a bunch of tiny little dictatorships run by these moderators, and they ego trip really, really, really powerfully. It's obviously not all of them, but the thing is that if you have even one ego tripping moderator on a Reddit who frequents the Reddit they moderate, it puts a bad face on every single other moderator to the point that it really taints. And to my view, it's been tainted. And it's funny because you'll notice that I'm actually banned from the Star Wars subreddit because I was using a program to post things because I go to sleep and I'd like to post things when it would be effective. So I like to set those things up in a schedule. I don't use that program anymore for what happened. Basically, it did something, it glitched and began just reposting that one post a million times without control. So I understand why they banned me. Don't send the Star Wars subreddit any hate for that ban, because from their perspective, it looked like my account was just spamming the subreddit continuously with content that wasn't even getting through.
I do wish they would respond to me, and I wish they would reconsider, because again, I've dropped the use of that program ever since that one incident. And I think that I do contribute a lot of content, and that I'm not a bad user of things. Like, I try to be respectful with people. So, but it's not. I say that to say that it's not like you can go and see that my thing is banned from a bunch of places. It's not that I'm banned from a bunch of places. It's just that my interactions on Reddit have been extremely uncomfortable many times. It may not even be most times, but it's enough times that every time I comment, I ask myself, is it worth it? Is it worth it? You know. So I don't really do social media a lot. If you reach out to me here, or you reach out to me on Reddit, know this too. I'm kind of shy. It can be a bit nerve-wracking for me to work up, and it sounds really dumb because I'm the guy who posts every week videos where I'm just talking for like an hour or more. That being said, live interaction with other people, especially if they're fans of like my work, I'm shy. I can't say it any other way, you know. It's not that I'm afraid necessarily. It does require a particular kind of courage from me to respond to people and to engage, and it is very draining for me. So if you ask me questions on Reddit and you see that I don't get back to you that day, or it's taking me a while to get back to you, I'm not avoiding you. I'm probably just feeling pretty weak. You know, I'm not in my strength. I'm not finding myself when I'm confronting those messages in a place where I can respond to them. I ask that you be, you know, understanding and forgiving with that, because it is the case that I'm not a social media person, and therefore I'm not very active on those things. I will try to be, though, and you do see that I am very active in my comments. I do like to do that. And with that, I think I've rambled on plenty. So I will go ahead and put it down here. Oh, real quick, and I can't believe I almost forgot this. Before I go, thanks again for 1,000 subscribers. That's fantastic. You know, it's happened so quick too. When I started posting these, I had no idea if anyone would even like it. I was honestly terrified that my comments sections would just fill up with angry fans from both, who would be displeased, like that I'm not doing their universe properly because I'm having them compete. If you look up some videos on Star Wars, you'll find that some of the books and lore and stats that have been given on their blasters make them outrageously powerful, to the point that like the things in the movies don't make sense anymore. And then you also have similar things in Warhammer, and I'm here, and again, I will say this as many times as I need to. I will always say this, and I hope that people can hear it and pick up on it and know it. It is about a good story. It is about a good story. That's what this is about, a good story. You can't have good story without adversity. You can't have good story without good rivals. So, you know, when you're looking at the Clone Troopers, think the 2003 series. Okay? Think that. That's a fantastic way to think of where and how the expertise and skill level of the Clone Troopers is going to be at. It's going to be at a 2003 level, and take the personality from the later Clone Wars TV show, where we have Rex and Echo and all the other clones of the Bad Batch and everybody there. That's just fantastic characters. Take their personalities and give them all the training and speciality and expertise and professionalism that we saw in the clones in the 2003 series. And to remind you guys, in the 2003 series, we have General Grievous go in and cut his way through a whole squad of Jedi Masters. And yeah, there's a Padawan who dies and a Jedi Knight or two who die as well. But like mostly Masters. And he mops the floor with all of them. Effortlessly, you can say. Like, he just completely goes in there and eats them alive. In fact, that's the reason he took them on himself, because he knew he could. And then the clones bust in, and yes, they are ARC troopers, but they're still just clones, not Force sensitives. And this guy was bossing around these Jedi from this series who can do the things that you see Jedi do in this series. And the clone troopers fend his ass off entirely, blow him away, make him back off. And honestly, if it weren't for the fact that they were surrounded by a whole army and had to evac Jedi in order to save their lives, it's unclear as to who would have won and who would have lost. So just yeah, it's like they're badass. They're awesome. I love those clone troopers. Those are my clone troopers. Fuck, I'm getting so off topic. I'm so sorry. I ramble. It's a thing that I do. Thinking, where was I at? Oh, right. So I was just really scared that my comments were going to fill up with that and I was going to get down votes. And I was thinking, man, you know, if that starts happening, should I just persevere and finish, or should I just quit? You know, and the opposite happened. It's so incredibly rewarding for me to have seen that, you know, that fan love is that strong. Because right now there's so much vitriol, so much hate everywhere from all sides. And some of it is justified, really, but some of it is just hate for hate's sake, you know? And I'll say right now, unabashedly too, I am not a fan of cancel culture. While there are certain people who do horrible and toxic things and deserve to be, I guess you'd call it canceled, or at least socially punished for those horrible things, these horrible things should not extend to, like, the things that we've been seeing them extend to, like tweets from years ago. Come on. Honestly, even tweets in general shouldn't get you canceled unless they are particularly, like egregious, you know? Otherwise, we're human beings. We make mistakes all the time. We say dumb things all the time. We are several things. We are multitudes within ourselves. We're not the same person at all times, and sometimes we're the worst person, and we make mistakes. Come on, guys. People's careers shouldn't be judged off of mistakes like that. Yes, go ahead and tap the nose. Yes, go ahead and tell people that it's not all right. But I'm not a fan of cancel culture. And you know, like that's a big thing that I've been seeing, you know, being overused, like just as an expression of this incredible vitriol and hate that is pervading within our societies right now, multiple societies. I think it's all over the world, really. And I was so afraid of that spilling over into here. And honestly, largely, it has not. Yes, there have been a few salty comments, you know, but for the most part, even the criticism that you guys give is voiced extremely kindly. And honestly, if you see that you voice kind criticism and I don't respond to it, or I don't like give it a heart or respond to it, it's because I've addressed it already in another comment, and I can't just address them every time. I understand that some people think that I undersell the Imperial Guard a bit. Trust me, I don't. There's a context to everything here. I'm fully aware of how badass the Imperial Guard is. I'm fully aware of the fact that they do what Space Marines do while not being Space Marines. And that there are incredibly competent commanders within the Guard. I'm also aware of the fact that in Gaunt's first book, he gets sent to his death for no good reason by a man who barely knows him just because the guy he knows doesn't like him, and that's all based off of the command structure. So just, I would ask that you keep that in mind, and also that you understand that again, it's all for the narrative. Suspend your disbelief. When I have the heads of the military cut off, that leads to bad decision making. Bad decision making leads to Lazarus making a really bad suicidal charge. Suicidal charges are not uncommon enough in the Imperium to be stopped just because they're happening. And I'm not going to go into that whole thing here. Gosh, I get distracted so easily. I'm so sorry. I'm very proud of this community, of both communities, of the Star Wars community and the fans of Star Wars who are here, and of the Warhammer community and the fans of Warhammer who are here, because you are incredibly good sports, you know? You are much more about the joy of the universes than you are about your particular biases within them. And I think that leads to a lot more enjoyment in general, honestly. I am overwhelmed by how much support I have received. Really. I've never published anything.
I only have written as a hobby, ever. And hearing your comments really make me feel like maybe I could one day do this for a living and do what I like for a living instead of, well, I mean, it's not like what I do right now. I don't like it necessarily. It's just, it's a job, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. Well, not that I even have one right now. Not that there's anything going on right now. But that's totally aside, and it's not a thing that I really want to bring up to you guys. Know this. Thank you. Your support, your subscriptions, they might not seem like a lot. They mean a lot to me. And I sincerely thank you for that. And so, after a much longer time than I had intended to go on about this, I will now proceed to go ahead and put this down and say, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, keep loving the things you love and liking the things you like, and I'll see you next time.